In law enforcement, credibility is everything. It's the foundation upon which entire cases are built. When a detective takes the stand and raises their right hand, juries need to believe every word. Defense attorneys will attack from every angle, searching for any reason to discredit testimony. One proven lie, one documented deception, and everything crumbles. That's why police departments maintain what's called a Brady list. It's named after a Supreme Court case that requires prosecutors to disclose any information that might impeach their own witnesses. If an officer has been found to lie, to falsify reports, to demonstrate dishonesty in any official capacity, that information must be turned over to the defense. In practical terms, it means that officer's career is effectively over. They can't testify credibly. They can't work cases that go to trial. Their value to any investigation is destroyed. This isn't theoretical. This is the standard every law enforcement officer knows from day one. Your word must be gold, because lives, freedom, and justice depend on it. So when Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sat for a sworn deposition and was asked directly whether he had ever been suspended as a law enforcement officer, his answer mattered. Not just legally, but morally. Not just for that case, but for every case his department handles. He said, no. If you want to understand how badly a homicide investigation can go wrong, you need to understand who's making the decisions. And if you're finding value in this deep dive into the Nancy Guthrie case and the systemic failures surrounding it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. We're committed to bringing you thoroughly researched, documented analysis of cases that demand accountability. Your support helps us continue this critical work. Now, let's talk about credibility. Let's pause there for a moment, because we need to establish exactly what happened next. How a journalist's routine background check for a missing person case uncovered something that had been hidden for 4 decades. How records that should have been disclosed, documents that should have ended a law enforcement career before it truly began, somehow stayed buried while a man with a documented history of violence, dishonesty, and insubordination rose to become the chief law enforcement officer for an entire county. Stephanie Murray is a reporter for the Arizona Republic. When she was assigned to cover the Nancy Guthrie disappearance, she did what any thorough journalist does. She wanted to know if Sheriff Nanos had ever worked a case like this before. Had he investigated similar disappearances during his time with the El Paso Police Department in Texas, where he worked before coming to Arizona? She requested his personnel file. What she received was remarkable, not just for what it contained, but for the fact that it still existed at all. 40 years of records, meticulously preserved by the El Paso Police Department Internal Affairs Division. A complete history card documenting every disciplinary action taken against Officer Christopher Nanos from the day he entered service in February of 1976 until his resignation in 1982. The document Murray obtained wasn't a summary. It wasn't a redacted overview. It was the full record. Incident after incident. Suspension after suspension. A pattern of behavior so severe, so persistent, that it defied explanation for how this officer remained employed for 6 years. 37 days of suspension. 8 separate disciplinary actions that rose to that level. Violations ranging from insubordination to excessive force, to dishonesty to threats of murder against witnesses who filed complaints against him. This wasn't a good cop who made a mistake. This was a problem officer whose conduct would have resulted in termination under any modern policing standard. The kind of officer that ethical departments identify early and remove before they destroy public trust or take a life. Let's walk through this record chronologically, because the pattern matters. This isn't about one bad decision. It's about a career defined by escalating misconduct, each incident building on the last, each disciplinary action apparently insufficient to change behavior. 1976. Officer Nanos receives his first written reprimand for violating department orders. It's the kind of minor infraction that happens with rookie officers still learning the rules. A sergeant sits you down, explains what you did wrong, puts it in writing, and you move on. 2 weeks later, Nanos is involved in an automobile accident that results in a civil lawsuit against the department. By 1978, he's written up for abuse of language. Temper issues are now on record. That same year brings another reprimand for off-duty conduct involving threats. The details tell you everything you need to know about judgment and impulse control. A man gave Nanos' sister a ride. Nanos confronted him, flashed his badge, and told him to stay away from her. This is the behavior of someone who uses their authority as a weapon, who sees the badge as a tool for personal intimidation rather than public service. July of 1979. One-day suspension for negligent discharge of a firearm. Nanos collected weapons from a traffic stop, brought them back to the station, and managed to fire a round inside what appears to have been the briefing room. He'd removed the magazine but forgotten to clear the chamber. The round struck a wall. Basic firearms safety, the kind of thing drilled into every officer from the academy onward, and he failed it in a building full of his fellow officers. Later that year, another suspension, this time for illegal gambling. Nanos was caught by undercover officers from his own department gambling in a pool hall. In Texas at that time, this wasn't just against department policy, it was against the law. He was actually arrested, cited for the offense, and suspended for a day. The failures to report for duty start stacking up. Habitual tardiness, no call, no show. The kind of reliability issues that make supervisors question whether this person can be counted on when it matters. If you can't show up for your shift, how can you be trusted with someone's life? But these incidents, as troubling as they are, pale in comparison to what comes next. Because in 1980, Officer Chris Nanos crosses a line that should have ended his career and possibly his freedom. According to the internal affairs investigation documented in his personnel file, Nanos and his partner arrested a man who had crashed his car. The arrestee had a friend present who witnessed what happened next. When Nanos tried to get the arrestee's home address for the booking paperwork, the man hesitated. He didn't want to give his address because he feared Nanos might go to his home and harass his wife. Nanos' response, according to both the arrestee and the witness, was to tell him not to worry. He wouldn't mess with his wife, using language so vulgar and sexually explicit that it demonstrated not just poor judgment, but active cruelty. When the arrestee objected to having his wife spoken about in this manner, Nanos threatened to take him outside and beat him. The man was booked. A few days later, he and his friend went to the police department's Internal Affairs Division and filed a formal complaint about the officer's conduct. Here's where it gets worse. A few days after that complaint was filed, Nanos and his partner spotted the witness, the friend who had corroborated the arrestee's story, on the side of the road. They made a U-turn, pulled over, and stopped him. What happened next, according to the complaint and the subsequent investigation, was witness intimidation in its most raw and threatening form. Nanos told the witness that every time he saw him, he would stop him. Then he threatened to take him out to the desert and kill him. This wasn't hyperbole in the heat of an arrest. This wasn't a tense confrontation where words were said in the moment. This was premeditated retaliation against someone who had exercised their legal right to file a complaint against a police officer. When the witness went back to Internal Affairs and reported this second incident, investigators called Nanos in and asked him about it. He denied it, said it never happened, claimed they never stopped the witness. The investigators pulled the radio logs and computer records. Nanos and his partner had run a warrant check on the witness. Documentary evidence proved they had indeed stopped him, exactly as alleged. Nanos had lied to Internal Affairs investigators. For this entire series of incidents, threatening an arrestee, sexually explicit comments about his wife, threatening to beat him, spotting a witness who filed a complaint, making a U-turn to stop him, threatening to murder him, then lying to investigators about whether it happened at all, Officer Chris Nanos received a 10-day suspension. Not termination. Not criminal charges for witness intimidation or making terroristic threats. 10 days. Without pay. You might think that would be the wake-up call, that after threatening to murder a witness and lying to Internal Affairs, an officer might recognize they're on borrowed time and fundamentally change their behavior. the tardiness continues. More suspensions for failure to report for duty. This is someone who fundamentally cannot or will not follow the most basic requirements of employment. December 1981. Another excessive force complaint under investigation. And then, March 23, 1982, the incident that should have sent Chris Nanos to prison. A robbery involving multiple suspects. One of them, a man named Carlos Rojas, was handcuffed and turned over to Officer Nanos for transport to booking. Multiple witnesses, including other officers, saw what happened next. Nanos repeatedly punched Rojas, kicked him, put him in a headlock, then threw him into the patrol vehicle. Rojas sustained a major head injury, described in reports as a large gash or defect. He was bleeding and lost consciousness. He was taken to Thomason General Hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. Read that again. A handcuffed suspect in police custody, beaten so severely by an officer that he required ICU admission for head trauma. Nanos was relieved of duty that same day. This is the most serious administrative action a department can take short of termination. It means you turn in your badge and gun immediately. You're done, pending investigation. The case was so serious that it went before a grand jury. The El Paso County District Attorney's Office was prepared to seek criminal charges. But there was a legal problem that ultimately prevented prosecution. Carlos Rojas was being charged with robbery. His defense attorney advised him correctly that testifying about the incident before the grand jury might require him to admit facts related to the robbery itself, which could be used against him in his own criminal case. Rojas was caught in an impossible situation. Get beaten unconscious by a police officer, but unable to testify about it without potentially incriminating himself. The grand jury, without his testimony, returned a no bill. No criminal charges against Nanos. But the administrative investigation had no such constraints. The witness statements from other officers, the medical records, the documented injuries, all of it pointed to one conclusion. On March 23, 1982, Officer Chris Nanos beat a handcuffed man so badly he required intensive care. The El Paso Police Department gave him a 15-day suspension, the longest suspension of his career. It made the local newspaper. The article is still available. It documents everything. A 6-year veteran of the police force, relieved of duty after a suspect he arrested wound up hospitalized with head injuries, then suspended 15 days. Shortly after this incident, Nanos faced another disciplinary action related to insubordination over vehicle towing procedures. The department recommended a 3-day suspension. Rather than accept it, Nanos offered to resign in lieu of discipline. The El Paso Police Department accepted. In 1982, Chris Nanos' career in Texas law enforcement ended. Now let's jump forward to the present day, to a sworn deposition taken in connection with a lawsuit filed by Sergeant Aaron Cross against Sheriff Chris Nanos. Cross is the president of the Pima County Deputies organization, representing 306 of the approximately 400 sworn deputies and detectives in the department. He's not a disgruntled outlier. He's the elected voice of more than 3/4 of the rank and file. During this deposition, Nanos was placed under oath. He swore to tell the truth, and then he was asked a direct question. Have you ever received discipline as a law enforcement officer? Nanos answered, yes. Then came the follow-up. Did you ever receive a discipline that rose to the level of a suspension? Nanos answered, no. We just walked through his documented history. 37 days of suspension across 8 incidents, a 15-day suspension that made the newspaper, a 10-day suspension for threatening to murder a witness, multiple 1-day, 2-day, 3-day suspensions for everything from negligent discharge to illegal gambling to habitual failure to show up for work. Under oath, he said no. When this testimony became public, when reporters started asking questions about the obvious contradiction between his sworn answer and his documented record, Nanos' attorney provided an explanation. It appears in the 22-page response that the sheriff submitted to the Pima County Board of Supervisors when they demanded answers about his background. The response claims that Sheriff Nanos did not understand the question, that because the questions before and after dealt with the Arizona Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, Nanos interpreted the suspension question as referring only to his time with the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not his previous employment in Texas. Think about that explanation for a moment. A man who spent 6 years with the El Paso Police Department, accumulating more suspensions than most officers receive in entire careers, who resigned in lieu of discipline, who had his 15-day suspension documented in the newspaper, somehow didn't understand that a question about whether he had ever been suspended as a law enforcement officer included that employment. The attorney's response goes on to say that Nanos spotted the misunderstanding shortly after the deposition and promptly notified his attorney. But here's what matters legally. Perjury isn't about misunderstandings. It's about knowingly making false statements under oath on material matters. When you raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth, you have a responsibility to answer accurately. If you don't understand a question, you ask for clarification. You don't give an answer you know to be false and then claim confusion later. A reasonable person, asked whether they had ever been suspended as a law enforcement officer, would understand that to include all law enforcement employment, particularly when that person had been suspended 8 times, totaling 37 days. But the deposition isn't the only place where Chris Nanos' credibility comes into question. The 22-page response to the Pima County Board of Supervisors is a masterclass in evasion, blame-shifting, and statements contradicted by documentary evidence. The board asked 4 specific areas of inquiry. They wanted to know about Nanos' work history with El Paso Police Department, his personnel discipline record, immigration enforcement issues, and budget management. Critically, the board requested that these answers be provided under oath. They wanted sworn testimony, which would carry legal consequences for false statements. Nanos' attorney submitted a 22-page written response. It was not under oath. Let's examine what that response says about his disciplinary history, because the language is revealing. Quote, "The sheriff's minimal disciplinary history is irrelevant to the performance of his official duties." Minimal. 37 days of suspension is characterized as minimal. The response continues. The sheriff was the subject of robust public scrutiny during the election, and the public records included information about his decorated career as a sworn peace officer. The voters of Pima County elected him as sheriff. Whatever the sheriff did or didn't do before being elected is necessarily irrelevant to his performance of the duties of his office. This argument fundamentally misunderstands or deliberately misrepresents the issue. The voters of Pima County didn't know about this history. It was hidden for 40 years. It only became public when Stephanie Murray requested those records while investigating the Nancy Guthrie case. The election happened before any of this was revealed. To claim that voters knew and didn't care is demonstrably false. They couldn't have known what was never disclosed. The response then addresses the discipline directly. While employed with El Paso Police Department, Chris Nanos was the subject of various disciplinary actions which included counseling, reprimands, and suspensions. The discipline and the actions that gave rise to it happened more than 4 decades ago. The sheriff has little specific recollection of those events. Little specific recollection. Of being suspended 15 days for beating a handcuffed man unconscious, of threatening to murder a witness who filed a complaint, of being arrested for illegal gambling, of firing a weapon in the police station. These aren't minor incidents that fade with time. These are career-defining moments, the kind of things that would haunt an ethical person for decades. And yet, under oath, little specific recollection. The response does make one true statement. It notes that when Nanos applied to Pima County in 1984, he was subject to a standard background check, which included completion of the county job application, interviews with past employers and personal references, an oral interview, a psychological evaluation, and a polygraph examination. This raises profound questions about that hiring process. Did Nanos fully disclose his disciplinary history on his application? Did El Paso Police Department provide complete information when contacted? Did the polygraph examination include questions about past misconduct? Because if Nanos disclosed everything, and Pima County hired him anyway, that's a failure of the hiring agency. But if he concealed or minimized his history, if he failed to disclose suspensions or the circumstances of his resignation, that's grounds for termination under any law enforcement agency's policies. You cannot lie your way into a badge. The response claims, quote, "At every step in the hiring process, the sheriff was truthful and forthcoming. That statement cannot be reconciled with 40 years of that history remaining unknown until a reporter requested it. If he was truthful and forthcoming, why did no one know? Why wasn't this public record? Why did it take a journalist investigating a missing person case to uncover what should have disqualified him from certification in the first place?" There's another credibility issue in that 22-page response, and it relates to Lieutenant Heather Lapan. She was Nanos's political opponent in the election, a lieutenant in the sheriff's department, beloved by the rank and file according to multiple sources, who ran against her own boss for the position of sheriff. In the final weeks before the election, during early voting, Lieutenant Lapan was placed on administrative leave. She was also given what amounts to house arrest, restricted to her home except for specific approved activities. And she was placed under a gag order, prohibited from speaking publicly about the allegations against her or defending herself against attacks. This is extraordinary. A political candidate silenced by her opponent, who also happens to be her boss, unable to campaign, unable to respond to criticism, functionally removed from public life during the most critical period of the election. Nanos won by 481 votes. After the election, Lieutenant Lapan left the Pima County Sheriff's Department. She's now employed by a law enforcement agency in the Phoenix area, where they hired her as a lateral transfer at the rank of lieutenant. She filed a federal lawsuit against Nanos alleging improper use of his office for political purposes. That lawsuit has not yet gone to trial. There's a settlement conference scheduled in front of a federal judge, but no final resolution. Here's what Nanos's 22-page response says about this situation. The allegations made by Lapan have been extensively litigated in federal court. That's false. The case hasn't gone to trial. There's been no litigation in the sense of a trial or evidentiary hearing. There have been procedural motions and discovery, but extensively litigated is a mischaracterization of a case still pending. The response also states, the lawsuit has not resulted in any finding of wrongdoing, and despite all the unrelenting scrutiny, there has never been a sustained finding critical of the department's discipline of Lapan. 2 weeks before this response was submitted, an independent attorney hired to investigate the situation issued a report. That report found that Sheriff Nanos improperly used his office for political purposes in his treatment of Lieutenant Lapan. So the claim that there has never been a sustained finding critical of the department's actions is contradicted by a report issued 2 weeks earlier by an independent investigator. The response also claims that Lapan was subject to the same policy requirements on administrative leave as any other employee, and that her freedom of movement was not restricted. Sergeant Aaron Cross has stated that there exists an audio recording of Lapan's captain explicitly placing her under house restriction. If such a recording exists, and it's presented in court, the claim that her movement wasn't restricted becomes another documented falsehood. Why does all of this matter? Why spend so much time documenting the credibility issues, the discipline history, the contradictions between sworn statements and documented facts? Because Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Because her daughter Savannah is still waiting for answers. And because the quality of a homicide investigation depends entirely on the competence, experience, and integrity of the people running it. Sergeant Cross represents 306 deputies. He speaks with them daily. He hears their concerns, their frustrations, their observations about what's happening inside the department. And what he describes is an agency in crisis. Of the approximately 195 deputies currently assigned to patrol, 101 are on probation. That means they have less than 1 year of experience. If you call 911 in Pima County, the odds are better than even that the deputy who responds will have been on the job for less than 12 months. Experience is the most valuable asset a law enforcement officer has. The first 3 to 5 years, you're still learning, still figuring out how to handle the chaos of domestics, the complexity of criminal investigations, the split-second decisions that can mean life or death. A deputy with 10 years on has seen things, made mistakes, learned from them. A deputy with 10 months on is still trying to remember all the codes and procedures. This staffing crisis didn't happen by accident. It's the result of leadership that drives experienced people away. When you watch a beloved lieutenant get placed under house arrest for running against the sheriff, when you see retaliation become standard operating procedure, when you realize that speaking up means becoming a target, the good ones leave. They go to agencies where competence is valued and integrity isn't punished. The homicide unit that initially caught the Nancy Guthrie case was understaffed and inexperienced. Not because the individual detectives lacked dedication, but because the experienced investigators had been transferred out, pushed out, or driven out by a command structure more concerned with loyalty than competence. When Sergeant Cross spoke with the detectives assigned to the case, they told him something critical. The decision to release Nancy's house back to the family, the rush to wrap up the crime scene processing, that didn't come from the investigators. That was command-driven. Orders from above to hurry up, to finish, and move on. There was no legitimate investigative reason for that rush. Nancy lived alone. Securing the scene for additional days or even weeks wouldn't have inconvenienced anyone, and could have allowed for more thorough processing, additional searches, consultation with experts. But command wanted it done. Why? We don't know. But we know the decision wasn't made by the detectives who understand evidence collection. It was made by leadership. After Stephanie Murray's reporting revealed Nanos' disciplinary history, after the contradictions between his sworn testimony and documented facts became public, the Pima County Deputies organization took a vote. 306 members. One question. Do you have confidence in Sheriff Chris Nanos? The vote was unanimous. Not just no confidence and a demand for his resignation. Think about what that means. The largest union representing deputies in the department, more than 3/4 of the sworn personnel, unanimously declaring that their elected sheriff should step down. This isn't a handful of malcontents. This is an organizational rebellion based on documented facts and direct experience working under his command. Nanos' response, when asked about the vote, was dismissive. He pointed out that there are 5 unions in the department, implying that the deputies' vote didn't represent everyone. That's technically true, but deliberately misleading. The 5 unions represent different groups. Corrections officers have their own unions. Commanders have an association. But the Pima County Deputies organization represents the overwhelming majority of sworn deputies and detectives, the people actually working cases and responding to calls. No other local elected officials have come to Nanos' defense. No law enforcement leaders have spoken up to support him. The silence is deafening. Because what can you say? How do you defend 37 days of suspension? How do you explain away threatening to murder a witness? How do you reconcile sworn testimony with newspaper articles documenting the opposite? There is a recall effort underway. Citizens gathering signatures to force a special election to remove Nanos from office. The will for recall exists. Sergeant Cross has made that clear. But the logistics are brutal. Under Arizona law, a recall petition for a Pima County elected official requires approximately 122,000 valid signatures. Given that some signatures will be challenged or invalidated, organizers estimate they need closer to 130 or 140,000. Here's the killer detail. Each petition page can only hold 10 signatures, and each page must be individually notarized. Do the math. 130,000 signatures divided by 10 per page equals 13,000 pages. 13,000 individual notarizations required. If this was an electronic petition, Sergeant Cross said he would have no doubt it would succeed. But the requirement for wet signatures, physical pages with physical notarizations, makes it extraordinarily difficult. It's almost as if the system is designed to make recall nearly impossible, even when the will of the voters has clearly changed. This is where we stand 3 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. A sheriff with a hidden history of violence and dishonesty leading the investigation. A department hemorrhaging experience because retaliation has become standard practice. Crime scenes released prematurely because command says so. Inexperienced detectives doing their best under impossible circumstances. And a family still waiting for answers. The Pima County Board of Supervisors has the authority to act. They can demand sworn testimony. They can refer potential perjury to the county attorney. They can use their oversight powers to require transparency and accountability. Whether they will remains to be seen. The Arizona Peace Officers Standards and Training Board, known as POST, has the authority to review law enforcement certifications. If an officer obtained certification through false statements or failure to disclose disqualifying history, POST can revoke that certification. Whether they will investigate Nanos remains to be seen. The voters have the recall option, difficult as it may be. Whether they'll overcome the logistical barriers remains to be seen. But while all of these processes unfold, while lawyers file motions and politicians consider their options and citizens gather signatures, there's still a daughter who doesn't know where her mother is. There's still a case that deserves the best investigators, the most experienced leadership, the kind of competence and integrity that should be the baseline expectation for any law enforcement agency. Nancy Guthrie deserved better from the beginning. She deserved detectives with decades of experience. She deserved a crime scene held as long as necessary. She deserved leadership that prioritizes solving the case over managing appearances. What she got was a department in crisis, led by someone who should never have been certified, investigating under conditions compromised by leadership failures that started 40 years ago in El Paso and continue today in Pima County. If this documentary analysis has provided value, if you believe accountability matters and that Nancy Guthrie's case deserves this level of scrutiny, please like this video and subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. This kind of deep research takes time and resources. Your support allows us to continue investigating cases where the official narrative doesn't match the documented facts. Sheriff Chris Nanos had testified under oath that he was never suspended as a law enforcement officer. The documents prove he was suspended 8 times, totaling 37 days, including a 15-day suspension that made the newspaper after he beat a handcuffed man unconscious. But here's what matters now. This wasn't just about what happened 40 years ago in El Paso. This is about a pattern that never changed. A pattern of dishonesty, retaliation, and surrounding himself with people cut from the same cloth. Because when you understand who Chris Nanos chose to promote, who he placed in positions of authority over critical investigations, you understand why the Nancy Guthrie case unfolded the way it did. Let's talk about how an outlaw becomes sheriff, and what happens to investigations when leadership can't be trusted. The 22-page response Sheriff Nanos submitted to the Pima County Board of Supervisors contains another lie. Not an interpretation, not a misunderstanding, a documented, provable falsehood about the circumstances of his departure from El Paso Police Department. The response states that Nanos resigned in lieu of accepting a 3-day suspension for insubordination, that he chose to leave rather than face minor discipline. It portrays his departure as voluntary, a decision to move on rather than accept punishment for a relatively small infraction. The El Paso Police Department records tell a different story. In his final incident with the department, Officer Nanos was openly insubordinate to his sergeant during a squad briefing. The issue was whether officers could seize certain types of license plates during traffic stops. Nanos disagreed with the policy and refused to follow it. When his sergeant corrected him in front of the squad, Nanos didn't back down. The sergeant had to stop the briefing, pull him aside, and attempt to address the insubordination privately. It didn't work. The sergeant ordered Nanos to write a memo explaining his behavior, acknowledging its inappropriateness and confirming he would follow orders going forward. Nanos's response was to write on the memo, quote, "I will not take plates," and slam it down next to the sergeant during the next briefing. For the second time in his career, Chris Nanos was relieved of duty. Badge and gun confiscated, sent home pending investigation. The sergeant wrote up the incident and recommended a 3-day suspension. But as the paperwork moved up the chain of command, someone finally did what should have been done years earlier. They reviewed Nanos's complete file. The pattern of violence, dishonesty, insubordination, threats, and chronic reliability issues. The 10-day suspension for threatening to murder a witness. The 15-day suspension for beating a handcuffed man unconscious. The gambling arrest. The negligent discharge. The habitual failures to report for duty. A 5-member panel convened to review the complete record. Their decision was unanimous. Termination. Chris Nanos was fired from the El Paso Police Department. He resigned before the termination could be finalized, but the decision had been made. The panel voted to end his law enforcement career. The local newspaper reported it. The headline read, "Decorated Policeman Quits." The article explains that Chris Nanos, described as a highly decorated El Paso police officer, had resigned from the police force after a Tuesday afternoon disciplinary hearing with his supervisors and police administrators. A board of 5 individuals had convened to address his conduct. You can be highly decorated and still be fired for a pattern of misconduct. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. But the context matters. Nanos didn't resign in lieu of a 3-day suspension. He resigned in lieu of being fired. That distinction is critical. Because if you're applying for a new law enforcement job and you're asked why you left your previous agency, personal reasons and better pay is a very different answer than "I was about to be terminated for a career-long pattern of misconduct." When Chris Nanos applied to Pima County Sheriff's Department in 1984, he filled out 2 applications, one for corrections officer, another to promote from corrections to deputy sheriff. Both applications are part of his personnel file, obtained by reporter Stephanie Murray and now available to the public. Both applications asked a direct question: why did you leave El Paso Police Department? Nanos wrote, "Personal reasons, betterment of myself, and better pay." He didn't mention being relieved of duty twice. He didn't mention the 5-member panel that unanimously voted to fire him. He didn't mention threatening to murder a witness, or beating a handcuffed man unconscious, or being arrested for illegal gambling. Personal reasons, better pay. Lying on a law enforcement application is grounds for immediate termination in every agency in this country. The application process is designed to filter out people who lack the integrity required for the job. If you lie to get the badge, you've demonstrated you'll lie while wearing it. Pima County sent a background investigation request to El Paso Police Department. The response is also part of the public record now. The chief of police for El Paso responded clearly. He did not recommend hiring Chris Nanos. He stated explicitly that El Paso Police Department would not rehire him if he applied. Think about what that means. His former chief, who had access to the complete disciplinary record, who knew about the violence and dishonesty and insubordination, told Pima County not to hire this person. We wouldn't take him back. You shouldn't either. Somehow, Pima County hired him anyway. Either the background investigator missed the red flags, which represents catastrophic failure in the hiring process, or someone ignored them, which represents something worse. But however it happened, Chris Nanos went from being unemployable in Texas to starting over in Arizona. From security guard at a dog kennel, to corrections officer, to deputy sheriff, to sergeant, to lieutenant, to chief, to undersheriff, to sheriff. 40 years of hiding the truth. 40 years of that record staying buried. Until a journalist investigating a missing person case asked for his personnel file and exposed what should have disqualified him from certification in the first place. Understanding Nanos's background helps explain the leadership decisions that compromised the Nancy Guthrie investigation. But there's another piece of this puzzle that's equally disturbing. The people he chose to promote. The command staff he surrounded himself with. Because a leader with a history of violence and dishonesty doesn't surround himself with people who will question or challenge him. He promotes people who think like him, who operate like him, who won't ask uncomfortable questions about orders that don't make sense. The current chief of the Criminal Investigations Division for Pima County Sheriff's Department has his own history. He's never been a detective, never worked a homicide, never conducted the kind of complex investigations his division is now responsible for handling. But he has something else on his record, something that, in any ethical department, would have ended his career. In the early 2000s, when he was a deputy, he was terminated by then-Sheriff Clarence Dupnick. The reason was documented. He struck a suspect who was handcuffed. The suspect had been injured, though it's unclear whether from a prior gunshot or other cause. The deputy's explanation, according to reports, was that he slapped the handcuffed man repeatedly to keep him from passing out. That's not a recognized medical treatment. That's abuse of a restrained person. It's the kind of conduct that demonstrates fundamental unsuitability for law enforcement. It's exactly the kind of thing that should result in permanent separation from the profession. He was fired. But he fought for his job back. The case went through appeals, eventually reaching the Arizona State Supreme Court. He won his appeal and was reinstated. He's now the chief of criminal investigations, overseeing homicide detectives, missing person cases, and every major investigation the department handles, including Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. He's never been a detective, but he has been fired for striking a handcuffed suspect. Those are his qualifications to oversee the most sensitive investigations in Pima County. According to Sergeant Cross, this chief has openly stated he was the most disciplined deputy in the history of the Sheriff's Department. Not said with shame, said as a point of pride, a badge of honor. I survived more discipline than anyone else, and I'm still here. That's the culture Chris Nanos created, where excessive discipline isn't a disqualification, it's a credential. Where the people who rise to command are the ones who think rules don't apply to them, who see accountability as something to fight rather than accept, who view victims and suspects as people to be controlled rather than served. When Sergeant Cross spoke with the homicide detectives initially assigned to the Nancy Guthrie case, they told him something critical. The decision to release her house back to the family, the rush to finish crime scene processing, that wasn't coming from them. That was command-driven. Orders from above to wrap it up, to move on, to close out the scene. Now you understand where those orders came from. A sheriff who spent his entire career avoiding accountability. A chief who was fired for abusing a handcuffed suspect and fought his way back. A command structure built on loyalty instead of competence, on obedience instead of integrity. The detectives knew they needed more time. Nancy lived alone. There was no urgent need to return the house. Additional processing, consultation with experts, methodical documentation of every detail, all of that could have continued for days or weeks without inconveniencing anyone. But command wanted it done. Why? We don't know. But we know the decision didn't come from the people who understand evidence collection. It came from leadership more concerned with appearances than answers, more focused on controlling the narrative than finding the truth. Those detectives are doing their best under impossible circumstances. 4 or 5 investigators still assigned to the case, according to Sergeant Cross. Working leads, following up on tips, trying to bring Nancy home to her daughter Savannah. But they're working under a cloud of incompetent leadership, with a command structure that has demonstrated it will prioritize politics over investigation, retaliation over support, loyalty over justice. Let's talk about retaliation, because it's not theoretical. It's not speculation. It's documented pattern and practice. Lieutenant Heather Lapan was beloved by the rank and file, experienced, competent, respected. She decided to run for sheriff against her own boss, Chris Nanos. It's the kind of thing that happens in democratic societies. Employees can run for office. Competition in elections is healthy. The best candidate should win. In the final weeks before the election, during early voting when every day of campaigning matters, Lieutenant Lapan was placed on administrative leave. She was also given orders that amounted to house arrest, restricted to her home except for specific approved activities. She was placed under a gag order, prohibited from speaking publicly, unable to defend herself against attacks, unable to campaign. There exists an audio recording, according to Sergeant Cross, of her captain explicitly placing her under house restriction. Not just administrative leave, not just desk duty, house arrest. Her opponent, who also happened to be her boss, silenced her during the most critical period of the campaign. She couldn't knock on doors, couldn't appear at forums, couldn't respond to criticism, functionally removed from the race while still technically a candidate. Chris Nanos won the election by 481 votes. After the election, Lieutenant Lapan left Pima County Sheriff's Department. A law enforcement agency in the Phoenix area hired her as a lateral transfer at the rank of lieutenant. They recognized her value. They knew what Pima County was losing. She filed a federal lawsuit alleging improper use of office for political purposes. The case hasn't gone to trial yet. There's a settlement conference scheduled in front of a federal judge. But 2 weeks before Sheriff Nanos submitted his 22-page response to the Board of Supervisors, an independent attorney hired to investigate the situation issued a report. That report found that Sheriff Chris Nanos improperly used his office for political purposes in his treatment of Lieutenant Heather Lapan. Yet in his response to the board, Nanos' attorney claimed, quote, "There has never been a sustained finding critical of the department's discipline of Lapan." That's a lie. Documented. Provable. A report from an independent investigator issued 2 weeks earlier directly contradicts that statement. The response also claims that allegations made by Lapan have been extensively litigated in federal court. The case hasn't gone to trial. There's been discovery and procedural motions, but no trial, no evidentiary hearing, nothing that could be characterized as extensive litigation. The response claims Lapan's freedom of movement was not restricted. There's an audio recording of her captain placing her under house restriction. Lie after lie after lie, submitted to the Board of Supervisors in a document they specifically requested be provided under oath. Nanos' attorneys submitted it without oath, avoiding the legal consequences for provably false statements. Sergeant Aaron Cross has been with Pima County Sheriff's Department for 26 years. He's the second most senior sergeant in the entire agency, SWAT team member, patrol supervisor, elected president of the Pima County Deputies organization, representing 306 of the approximately 400 sworn deputies and detectives. His current assignment is the Telephonic Reporting Center, taking reports over the phone for minor incidents, garden hoses stolen from front yards, minor property damage, the kind of calls that require zero supervisory skill, zero tactical expertise, zero leadership ability. He's the first sergeant in department history assigned to that position full-time. It's not a promotion, it's not lateral development, it's punishment. Retaliation for speaking up, for representing his members, for demanding accountability. 26 years of experience, second most senior sergeant. Skills and knowledge that should be deployed training new deputies, supervising critical incidents, leading teams in complex operations. Instead, he's taking theft reports over the phone because he dared to challenge leadership. That's the cost of integrity in Chris Nanos' department. You end up at the Telephonic Reporting Center, or transferred to the jail, or forced out entirely, like Lieutenant Lapan. The message is clear. Loyalty is rewarded. Competence without loyalty is punished. Speaking truth gets you buried. The staffing crisis isn't an accident. It's the inevitable result of a retaliatory culture. Pima County Sheriff's Department currently has approximately 195 deputies assigned to patrol. 101 of them are on probation, meaning they have less than 1 year of experience. More than half the patrol force. If you call 911 in Pima County, the odds are better than even that the deputy who responds has been on the job less than 12 months, still learning radio codes, still figuring out how to write reports, still developing the instincts that come from seeing hundreds of calls, making thousands of decisions, learning from mistakes in situations where the stakes were lower. Experience is everything in law enforcement. The first 3 to 5 years, you're still learning. Your head is spinning trying to absorb policies, procedures, laws, tactics, de-escalation techniques, evidence collection, report writing, courtroom testimony. A deputy with 10 years on has made mistakes and learned from them, has handled complex situations and developed judgment, has earned the trust that comes from proven competence. A deputy with 10 months on is still trying to figure out if they're cut out for this job. The homicide unit suffered the same exodus. Experienced investigators transferred out, pushed out, or driven out by a command structure more concerned with loyalty than solving cases. When the Nancy Guthrie case came in, the unit was understaffed and underexperienced. Not because the individual detectives lacked dedication, but because the good ones had already left for agencies where competence was valued and integrity wasn't punished. Sergeant Cross reports that members tell him they're embarrassed to admit where they work when they attend multi-agency trainings. They used to be proud to wear the Pima County patch. Now it's a sheepish admission, accompanied by uncomfortable questions about what's happening down there, why they haven't left yet, whether the stories about their sheriff are true. Morale isn't low. It's destroyed. And the vote of no confidence reflected that reality. 306 deputies voted. The question was simple. Do you have confidence in Sheriff Chris Nanos? The result was unanimous. Not just no confidence and a demand for his resignation. Think about what it takes to get 306 law enforcement officers to unanimously agree on anything. These are people trained to question, to investigate, to demand evidence before reaching conclusions. Getting them all to agree on lunch is difficult. Getting unanimous agreement that their elected sheriff should resign represents a crisis of legitimacy that cannot be overstated. When asked about the vote, Sheriff Nanos responded dismissively. He pointed out there are 5 unions in the department, implying the deputies' vote didn't represent everyone, that it was just one faction expressing discontent. That's deliberately misleading. The 5 unions represent different groups. Corrections officers have their own unions with their own concerns. Commanders have an association. But the Pima County Deputies Organization represents more than 3/4 of sworn deputies and detectives, the people actually working cases, responding to calls, conducting investigations. 76.5% of eligible personnel said their sheriff should resign. That's not a faction. That's not sour grapes. That's an organizational rebellion based on documented facts and direct experience working under leadership that values loyalty over justice. No other local elected officials have publicly defended Nanos. No law enforcement leaders have spoken up on his behalf. The silence is deafening. Because what can you say? How do you defend 37 days of suspension? How do you explain threatening to murder a witness? How do you reconcile sworn testimony denying suspensions with newspaper articles documenting them? The answer is you can't. So they say nothing. The Pima County Board of Supervisors requested answers to 4 areas of concern: work history, personnel discipline, immigration enforcement, budget management. They specifically asked for sworn responses, understanding that the credibility issues demanded testimony with legal consequences for false statements. Nanos' attorney submitted a 22-page response, not under oath. When questioned about why the response wasn't sworn, the attorney reportedly claimed it was a matter of semantics. You didn't specifically use the word sworn in your request, so we didn't provide sworn answers. The board required Nanos to submit the response within 10 days. He failed to meet that deadline. So now he's in an interesting position. Does he swear to the accuracy of what he already submitted, knowing it contains demonstrable falsehoods about Lieutenant Lapan, about the circumstances of his departure from El Paso, about his disciplinary history? Does he commit perjury to avoid admitting he lied in the original response? Or does he admit the response contains inaccuracies, undermining everything he claimed and confirming he can't be trusted to tell the truth even when directly questioned by the body with oversight authority? The board is meeting in executive session to discuss next steps. Supervisor Steve Hines has led the effort to demand accountability. He's spending political capital on this fight, taking heat from Nanos' supporters, facing criticism for going after an elected official. That takes courage. That takes principle. And Sergeant Cross is right that the other supervisors need to feel supported by the public if they're going to continue pushing for answers. If you live in Pima County, contact your Board of Supervisors representative. Tell them you support the investigation. Tell them you expect sworn answers to sworn questions. Tell them that leadership credibility matters, that Nancy Guthrie deserves better. that 306 deputies representing more than 3/4 of the force don't demand resignation lightly. Your voice matters. Democratic accountability only works when elected officials know the public is paying attention. There's a recall effort underway, citizens gathering signatures to force a special election to remove Nanos before his term ends. The will exists. Sergeant Cross has confirmed that. If this were an electronic petition, he has no doubt it would succeed. But Arizona law makes recall deliberately difficult. The petition requires approximately 122,000 valid signatures. Given that some will be challenged or invalidated, organizers estimate they need closer to 130 or 140,000. Each petition page can only hold 10 signatures, and each page must be individually notarized. Do that math. 130,000 signatures divided by 10 per page equals 13,000 pages. 13,000 individual notarizations required. Every single one must be scheduled, completed, verified. The logistical burden is staggering. Compare that to running for office in the first place. Those signature-gathering petitions can be done electronically. Digital signatures, easy submission. But removing someone once they're in office? Physical signatures only. Wet ink, notary stamps. It's almost as if the system is designed to make recall nearly impossible, even when the will of the voters has clearly changed, even when new information reveals the person they elected is fundamentally unfit for office. Even if the recall effort succeeds in gathering enough signatures, validated and submitted, it then goes on a ballot. More time, more process, more opportunities for the well-funded incumbent to attack the effort, to muddy the waters, to run out the clock. Meanwhile, investigations continue. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her daughter Savannah is still waiting for answers. And the department tasked with finding those answers is led by someone 306 deputies say should resign, overseen by a chief who was fired for striking a handcuffed suspect, operating under a command structure built on loyalty instead of competence. When Sergeant Cross talks about his members, you hear the pride in his voice. These are good people, dedicated professionals who love their jobs, who care about public safety, who want to serve their community with excellence. They're not the problem. They never were. The problem is leadership that drives good people away, that punishes competence and rewards obedience, that makes decisions based on politics instead of investigation, that values appearances over answers. The problem is a sheriff who hid a career-ending disciplinary history for 40 years, who lied under oath about suspensions documented in newspaper articles, who retaliated against a political opponent by placing her under house arrest during an election, who promoted a chief with no detective experience but a termination for abusing a handcuffed suspect. The problem is a system that makes it nearly impossible to remove an elected official even when the facts demand it, that allows someone fundamentally unfit for office to continue making decisions that affect people's lives, people's safety, people's chance at justice. Nancy Guthrie deserved experienced investigators from day one. She deserved a crime scene held as long as necessary. She deserved leadership that prioritized solving her case over managing appearances. She deserved better than what she got. Think about what happens when this case eventually reaches trial, if investigators identify and arrest whoever is responsible for Nancy's disappearance. The defense will do what every defense attorney does: attack the credibility of the investigation, question the chain of custody, challenge the decisions made in those critical early hours. And they'll have ammunition: a sheriff who lied under oath, a chief who was fired for excessive force, a crime scene released prematurely under pressure from command, inexperienced investigators supervised by people who never worked homicide, a department in crisis, hemorrhaging talent with more than half the patrol force under 1 year experience. Every one of those facts will be used to create reasonable doubt, to suggest the investigation was compromised, to argue that evidence can't be trusted when the people collecting it worked for leadership that can't tell the truth. Nancy Guthrie will pay the price for Chris Nanos' dishonesty. Savannah will pay the price for his retaliation against competent people who dared to challenge him. Justice will be harder to achieve because the person leading the agency can't be trusted to testify honestly. That's the cost of hidden histories. That's the price of ignoring red flags during background checks. That's what happens when someone who should never have been certified becomes the chief law enforcement officer for an entire county. Senator Mark Kelly made phone calls about the Nancy Guthrie case, applied pressure to ensure the investigation received resources and attention. That's appropriate. That's what elected officials should do when constituents need help navigating bureaucracy or ensuring their concerns are heard. But there's another case that could use that attention. Another daughter who needs answers. Tiffany Glass, whose mother was killed in what appears to be a triple homicide in Phoenix. She's been advocating for her mother's case, trying to generate the same kind of attention and resources that Nancy Guthrie's case received. Senator Kelly could make those phone calls, could ensure Phoenix Police Department has what they need, could use his position to keep that case in the public eye. Victims don't pick and choose when to matter. They all deserve advocacy, resources, and justice, not just the ones whose cases happen to generate headlines. And the Pima County Board of Supervisors could ensure that every major investigation in their jurisdiction is led by people with integrity, supervised by command staff with the right experience, supported by a sheriff who can be trusted to tell the truth under oath. The Arizona Peace Officers Standards and Training Board could investigate how Chris Nanos obtained certification when his background check should have revealed disqualifying information. They could examine whether his application contained material falsehoods. They could determine whether someone who lied to get the badge should be allowed to keep it. The voters could support the recall effort, despite the logistical challenges, could attend Board of Supervisors meetings, could demand accountability from every elected official who has the power to act but chooses silence instead. 40 years is a long time to hide the truth, but the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when journalists do their jobs. Stephanie Murray asked the routine question while investigating a missing person case. Have you worked anything like this before? She requested personnel records to find the answer. What she found was a career-ending disciplinary history that should have prevented certification in the first place. 37 days of suspension, threats to murder witnesses, beating a handcuffed man unconscious, being fired by a 5-member panel only to resign before the termination could be finalized, lying on the application to Pima County about why he left El Paso, and then lying under oath decades later when asked directly about suspensions that are documented in newspaper articles preserved in public libraries. The pattern never changed. Violence, dishonesty, insubordination, retaliation. The same behaviors that got him fired in 1982 are the same behaviors defining his leadership in 2025. Except now, he's not just a problem patrol officer. He's the sheriff, the person responsible for every major investigation in Pima County, the person whose credibility can make or break cases when they reach trial, the person whose decisions affect whether families like Nancy Guthrie's get answers or live with uncertainty forever. Sergeant Aaron Cross represents 306 deputies who unanimously voted that their sheriff should resign. He's not asking for special treatment. He's not pursuing a vendetta. He's trying to be the voice of men and women who love their jobs but can't trust their leadership, who want to serve their community with excellence but are embarrassed to admit where they work. His reward for that advocacy has been assignment to the Telephonic Reporting Center. 26 years of experience, second most senior sergeant in the department, relegated to taking theft reports over the phone because he dared to represent his members honestly. That's retaliation. That's the cost of integrity in Chris Nanos' department, and it's exactly why experienced people leave, why good investigators transfer out, why the homicide unit was understaffed and underexperienced when Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Leadership matters. Character matters. Credibility matters. Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just for the people working under that leadership, but for the victims whose cases demand the best possible investigation. Nancy Guthrie mattered. Savannah Guthrie matters. Every missing person, every homicide victim, every family waiting for answers matters. They deserve better than leadership that can't tell the truth. command staff promoted despite being fired for excessive force, and a system that makes accountability nearly impossible, even when the evidence is overwhelming. This investigation isn't over. The documentary record is clear. The newspaper articles are preserved. The sworn deposition testimony is on the record. The Board of Supervisors has the authority to demand answers and refer potential crimes to the appropriate prosecutors. The question is whether they'll use that authority, whether they'll push through the political discomfort and do what the evidence demands, whether they'll prioritize public safety over political convenience. The 306 deputies who voted no confidence are watching. The families of missing persons are watching. The community that depends on competent law enforcement is watching. And Nancy Guthrie's daughter is still waiting for answers about what happened to her mother, hoping that the people tasked with finding those answers are led by someone who can be trusted to tell the truth. That hope shouldn't be too much to ask, but in Pima County, under Chris Nanos' leadership, it apparently is. We'll continue following this story. We'll document every development in the Board of Supervisors' investigation. We'll track the recall effort. We'll keep Nancy Guthrie's name in the public eye, because media attention is the only thing preventing her case from fading into the background noise of unsolved disappearances. If you believe this kind of investigative journalism matters, if you think accountability is worth fighting for, if you agree that victims like Nancy Guthrie deserve the best possible chance at justice, please subscribe to Crime Case Analyst. Share this documentary with anyone who cares about law enforcement integrity, about missing persons advocacy, about the fundamental principle that people in positions of power must be held to the highest standards of honesty. Your engagement matters. Your voice matters. Democratic accountability only works when people pay attention, demand answers, and refuse to accept evasion as a substitute for truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about Nancy Guthrie. Thank you for supporting the 306 deputies who had the courage to speak up despite knowing it would cost them. And thank you, Sergeant Aaron Cross, for your integrity, your advocacy, and your unwavering commitment to the truth. Your department is lucky to have you, even if your leadership doesn't recognize it. Stay vigilant. Stay engaged. And never forget that silence enables injustice, while speaking truth, no matter the cost, is how we change systems that have failed the people they're supposed to serve. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation continues, and the fight for accountability is far from over.